There you go. Well, you just wave your magic wand there, Tony, and
no, I'm picking. I know there are times in which you help facilitate your goals and objectives by helping. But I do think it has gotten out of hand, and we've got to keep it in line. But that's what we're going to talk about with our next guest, Senator Rand Paul, who represents the state of Kentucky, the bluegrass state. He's joining us now from Capitol Hill to talk about really two issues. One, we do want to talk about this fiscal cliff that we're peering over the edge of, as well as the Treaty on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And so joining us now, Senator Paul, we want to welcome you to the Washington Watch edition of Today's Issues with Tim Wildman and Tony Perkins.
Good morning. Glad to be with you guys.
Well, Senator, you got a front row seat there. I hope there's a guardrail as you're peering over the fiscal cliff. What's it look like from your vantage point?
You know, one thing that's amazing to me is that someone created this notion of fiscal cliff. I mean, somebody, sounds like in a Hollywood studio, said, what should we call this? Let's call it the fiscal cliff, and then let's try to get what we want by telling and scaring people about a fiscal cliff. Half of the fiscal cliff involves people worried about government spending cuts. And, well, I don't really agree that cutting federal spending is some kind of cliff or something to be avoided. The other half of the fiscal cliff is that if taxes go up, it would be bad for the economy. Now, I do agree with that principle, so I do agree with half of the fiscal cliff. But the same people who argue, well, if taxes go up, it's bad for the economy, in their next statement say, well, let's only raise taxes on 40% of the nation's income, and that won't be so bad. But if it's bad to raise everyone's taxes, why isn't it just a little bit less bad to only raise some of the people's taxes?
Yeah, what's changed, you know, when we entered into this recession and we started the stimulus spending back in 2009, when our spending went from 3.9 trillion that year to where we're now at 3.7 trillion, almost an additional $2 trillion, or $1 trillion more. We look at the revenue in 2008, it was 2.7 trillion. We're now in this year that just ended, estimated 2.4 trillion, actually a decline in revenue coming in. How is raising taxes going to help increase the revenue?
Well, you've hit precisely on the issue. Revenue went down from 2007, 2008 forward because we entered into a recession. We didn't change tax rates in 2008. We changed tax rates in 2003. So for 5 years, revenue continued to be about 18% of GDP. Revenue didn't go down when the Bush tax rates were reduced. So now you have the same rates but lower revenue because you're in a recession. So raising rates isn't necessarily going to bring in more revenue. In fact, there have been many times in our history where we've lowered tax rates and actually brought in more revenue. We've lowered tax rates on the wealthy, and actually the wealthy end up paying a higher percentage of the income tax when we've lowered rates. But there's also been the opposite, where we've raised the tax rates on the rich, and we've gotten less revenue from them. It just happened in England 2 years ago. They raised the top 1% tax rates, and they got less revenue.
Talking to Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky. I'm Tim Wildman with Tony Perkins. Senator Paul, along those lines, I know a lot of Americans are skeptical of the federal government cutting anything significant. So all this attention that President Obama has put on this issue, of course, and the Democrats, is increased revenue by raising taxes on people making $250,000 a year or more. But I don't hear them saying specifically what they want to do or what they're going to commit to in terms of cutting the spending side. And so the history of the Congress, correct me if I'm wrong, basically has been to say we're going to cut in 10 years or 20 years or whatever. That's when the cutting of the spending is going to come. But the revenue, the tax increases, they need to come right now.
Well, they're not going to like you in Washington for saying that. You know, that's the mantra around here. They want to raise taxes now and cut spending later. And 10 years is a long time. Many different elections occur.
Yes.
Something you promise in 10 years may or may not ever happen. That's why I'm a big believer that most long-term projections are worthless because you can't keep your word if you're not here, but they're also worthless because it's really hard to make economic projections out 10 years. And really the biggest problem we have now, and we have to emphasize this over and over again, it's not tax rates, it's economic growth. If the economy were growing at 4% right now, there would be a much smaller deficit. We would still need to cut spending, but it wouldn't be nearly so dire. So we have to figure out how to get the economy growing again. We had times under the Reagan administration where the economy grew at 6%. But we're growing barely at 1%. With the new job loss numbers out, I'm concerned that we haven't necessarily turned the corner for recovery.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about this for just a moment. Kind of basic economics 101. How do you get the economy moving? It's not by more government spending. What they're talking about here, what's coming out of the administration is a focus strictly on revenue, nothing to do about spending. How do we get more money into the government coffers so we can continue these programs, which we're spending $1 trillion that we don't have every year?
Yeah, if you want to stimulate the economy, the only way that government can stimulate the economy is by leaving more revenue in the hands of the private sector. So that
and who is that in the private sector that creates the jobs and makes the economy grow? Who is that?
Well, it's people who have businesses. It can be small or big business. A lot of people want to point to small business. I really just want to point to private sector versus public sector.
But the Senator, what I want to point out is that that's the very group they want to tax. And
Exactly.
they want to take money out of their pocket that they would put into the economy. And when you put money into the economy, there's a multiplier effect. It creates more money. When it goes to government, it does not have that multiplier effect.
Well, and the other point is that when we look at tax revenue and we say, what about leaving it in the hands of the people who earned it? The people who earned it make wiser decisions than government. One, because it's theirs and they look at it more wisely. Milton Friedman put it very well when he said, nobody spends someone else's money as wisely or frugally as they spend their own, and that's why you want to leave it in the private marketplace. Plus, they earned it. It's not a question of fairness. Every day, 300 million consumers vote in the marketplace on how to distribute not only the goods, but the proceeds from those goods. But we're not competing, and we can't grow until we have a competitive tax rate. Right now, our corporate income tax is 35%, and Canada's is 15%. Most of Europe is in the low 20s. So we don't need just revenue-neutral tax changes. We need to actually reduce taxes. That's the only stimulus that would work. Reduce tax rates, leave more revenue in the private sector. But instead, what we're hearing in Washington is Republicans up here caterwauling and saying, oh, I'm not going to obey my taxpayer pledge anymore because woe is me, the Democrats won the election, and we need to now raise taxes. It was a bad idea before the election, and it's a bad idea after the election.
Absolutely.
Talking to Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky. We've got about 3 more minutes here left.
Hey,
on the program.
Tim,
Go ahead, Tony.
can I switch gears here? Because before we let the senator go, he's been one of those that's been outspoken on this UN treaty, on our UN convention on the rights of persons with disabilities. The motion to proceed passed. It's going on to the Senate floor. Where does that stand, and what can people do to weigh in on this?
You know, we've had a few Republicans who said they would vote against the treaty and now have switched. I don't want to mention their names on the air, but you're welcome to look up and find who these are. If your members of your audience would email those senators and try to get them to switch back, that would be a good help. And I'm opposed to any kind of UN treaty pretty much, period, but particularly any treaty that gives up sovereignty, who says to American citizens that you could be dragged before a tribunal that's headed up by such stalwarts of human rights as, you know, Syria and Iran and Libya and all these people. These are the people who sit on committees at the UN, and I don't want any American citizen ever to go before an international tribunal and have to answer to some despot from one of these, you know, Islamic fascist countries.
Well, let me just give out that.
But that sounds so good, Tony, and Senator Rand, Senator Paul. It sounds so that. So you guys are. What's it called, Tony? The what now on disabilities?
It's the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities.
So we're opposed to it.
Well, here's the problem is that if you want to help people with disabilities, one, the best way to do it is through your churches and voluntary action. If you think government should be involved and needs to do something to help people with disabilities, then go to your local government. If you think your local government won't work, you can come to your federal government, but for the most part, it ought to be local. But then you shouldn't really think, oh, well, why don't we go to an international group now and have them fix a problem I've got with whether or not I've got wheelchair access to a store. Most of these things have already been addressed in our country, but the bottom line is I don't want some, tin-horn dictator in Africa, ruling whether or not my business is disability friendly. And it's a huge mistake to do this. Mike Lee and Jim DeMint have been big in getting people together, and they'd be good to have one or both of them on to talk about, the coalition. My understanding is Senator Lee from Utah, I think he had 36 people opposing it at one time, and it only takes 34 to beat it. He's lost a few, not on his fault, but a few of them have flipped to the other side.
We got to run.
Those are the people you can try to get back.
Thank you. Senator Rand Paul's been our guest. On behalf of Tony Perkins, I'm Tim Wildman. Thank you, folks, for listening. Take care. Talk to you next time.